Guys, thank you very much for coming. I'm Wonbo Woo. I am a television news producer. We're going to be sitting here for part of it, so if you guys want to move over, it might be easier to see. But I'm a TV news producer. I spent the last 3 years at NBC, and before that I was at ABC, working on World News and Nightline. This is Chris Borrelli. He is a features writer and columnist, is that right? Yeah. For the Chicago Tribune, and we are, and he does a lot of long-form pieces about profiles about people.
I can say it.
All sorts of people.
I can say it. I do long-form narrative. I do a lot of cultural reporting. I do. I'm kind of a generalist, so I write about whatever I'm interested in. So that's nothing less than 2,000 words. That's generally it. So anyway, right, go ahead.
We also wanted to hear a little bit just before we get started about who you guys are. So if you wouldn't mind, if we can start over here and just kind of go around the room and if
you guys done this a bunch already where you've told everybody who you are?
No.
No? Oh, cool, okay.
We're the first!
We're fellows here, and so we do it a lot.
If you can just say who you are, where you're from, and if there is anything, don't feel obligated, but if there is anything that you find sort of hard about interviews you want addressed, you are welcome to say so.
I'm Tim Time, senior at Mizzou, working at the Columbia, Missouri newspaper there. I'm a photojournalism major, so it's not so much, I guess, in-depth interviewing that I do, but when working on like longer-term like photo stories, you know, obviously like building relationships with people and talking to them to understand like what kind of things you should look for in your photographs and to help tell the story. So.
My name is Aaron Reese. I'm also the Missourian at Mizzou. I guess most of my work at school and just in general has been with sports. So the biggest thing that I would find is, especially when you're covering like a big team that's an SEC or something like that, when you have a limited amount of access to people and you're in a scrub and those sorts of things, how to get things that are actually worthwhile and get past any sort of cliche and or telling and all those sorts of things.
Good luck.
Yeah.
I'm Vicki Diaz Camacho from the University of Kansas. The editor-in-chief at the University of Kansas. And I think what I find most difficult is getting people to open up. A lot of the time people are very reserved, so kind of getting past that.
Go this way.
I'm Connor Murphy from the Heights at Boston College. I think that what I find most difficult is getting like the trustworthy kind of relationship going with somebody that you just met.
I'm Hannah. I'm from Brandeis University. I'm editor of our news section, and yeah, I think just sort of developing like closer relationships with people so that you always know you can go to them and that you'll get good information from them. Yeah, sources. Yeah.
I'm Rebecca Ellis. I'm from the Brown Daily Herald, from Brown, and yeah, just like what people are saying, I guess, asking questions that go past the event that sort of speak to larger themes.
I'm Maya Vidar. I'm from the Dartmouth. And I think my main issue is we run like a feature magazine every week. It's and like I'm having trouble like conveying to my writers how to write like more in-depth pieces with their like sources, especially when we get like a lot of student perspectives. Like students aren't necessarily the best people to interview all the time. They're not like great at saying things that aren't just like, I mean, I guess I agree with you. So kind of like getting beyond that.
This is a good one.
Yeah, my name is Julian. I'm Bowdoin College, the Bowdoin Laureate. I'm a managing editor. A lot of my job is, like, again, talking to younger writers and kind of teaching them how to, like, conduct interviews and talk to people. And so just, I feel like with some people you get they're kind of natural interviewers and you say, like, oh, you have these skills, but it's how do you, like, present that in a way that is understandable and, like, narrow it down into some like talking points. Like, what are some things that you can do and kind of saying that to writers?
Hi, I'm Sonia Rao. I'm managing editor at Scholastic Press at Boston University. I'm actually also from the Chicago suburbs and want to pursue feature writing. But I think sorry?
What's up with?
Naperville? A little bit out. But
I'm from Providence actually, but I didn't live there.
I think my main struggle that I'd like to ask you guys about is actually integrating interviews into shorter features and how to kind of get to the heart of the person or part of concept in such a short word count.
Hi, I'm Clara Chan from the Columbia Daily Spectator. I think something I've definitely struggled with is whenever you have an interview with when a PR person is in the room, they keep trying to get things on background or off the record, so really navigating that kind of nuanced relationship of trying to get the actual person you're interviewing to open up to you when that person is in the room.
Wait, well, I think we missed somebody back there.
I'm Caroline. I go to University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I work for the Massachusetts Daily Collegian. Probably one of the most difficult positions to be in a newsroom is when you're conducting like a research or something like that, is trying to find results that aren't biased or exaggerated or corrupt information, and then getting that through fairly throughout the newsroom to get across like an accurate portrayal of like an incident or something like that. Because there's a lot of issues with like people writing something as like a bias or as an exaggerated portrayal of something.
Should we go back up to the front?
I'm Maya. I'm the magazine chair of the Harvard Crimson. Something I find difficult is when you're talking to someone who has a tendency to speak in sort of general terms or abstractions, how to get them to share specific stories and anecdotes and examples.
I'm Ramsey Foz. I write for the magazine Part of the Crimson and also for news. I'm wondering about sort of how to structure questions within an interview. Oftentimes I've got, one question that I really care about the most and might be sort of considered, a more difficult question, and I wonder where to place that in the sort of natural flow and cadence.
My name is Ignacio. I'm a writer for the Crimson, a sophomore, and one of the things that I find really difficult about interviews and that I'm trying to be cognizant about is sort of imposing as a journalist questions onto the person you're interviewing and maybe not getting the story that, or getting what they want to say and not getting the complete idea or complete narrative. So figuring out ways that you can sort of get your source to open up and have them tell the story for themselves without you sort of trying to manipulate their words or their notions or trying to pick at different things.
Hi, my name is Janisha Hughes. I go to Davidson College. I write freelance for all three of our college's publications, but primarily write for my own blog. I guess one of the questions that I have when it comes to interviewing is how to frame and structure my interview questions as to not to make my interviewee feel attacked, which is something I come across, especially with what I like to write about.
Hi, I'm Danielle Fox. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh, so I'm the editor-in-chief of the Pitt News. Something I'm interested in features reporting, primarily in subculture, is writing about something that the hook is kind of that it's weird, but being respectful to that thing that I'm profiling or talking about, but still acknowledging that maybe it's kind of kooky.
Okay. I'm your person. It's like my job description.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a design editor for the Wellesley News, and I was wondering if you had any tips on how to choose quotes when you have like a bunch of really good quotes.
We're doing introductions.
Are we doing introductions?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm Maddie. I'm a senior at Harvard, and I was the editor of the Crimson last year, and now I'm graduating. So.
Great. Well, we're really excited to have all of you guys here. So hopefully this will be fun. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off by just talking at you guys a bit for a little while. We're going to talk to each other and hopefully hit on a lot of the issues that we just touched on. After that, we are going to show you guys some examples. We may sort of intersperse them throughout as well, and then examples of things that we think work pretty well. And then we're going to do some Q&A and some role play exercises. So.
Yeah, I would say too that everything you guys said is stuff that, I don't know how you feel about it, but a lot of what you described is stuff that I go through all the time myself still. There's not one answer that fits any of these questions in a way, or one story that fits any of these questions. So it's stuff, I wrestle with all the time.
Yeah, do, for sure.
Good.
So I'm going to start and just ask,
okay.
can you
I feel like
trust?
we should face each other like on a Batman Superman poster. And we both saw it and we hated it. Well, I hated it, you liked it.
Yeah,
we just, yeah, sorry.
Everybody
no,
except
facing
me.
By the way, we should just say up front that we disagree on pretty much everything. Right?
But we are also, this is one of my closest friends within the fellowship. But yes, we do.
He didn't like Mad Max. I mean, come on, right?
Yeah, that movie sucked.
Thank you.
Thank you. See, it's not just me. But, do you want us on?
I do.
Oh.
I do.
Oh.
Now you
Oh,
can keep
no,
talking
no,
about
they
Mad
have to-
Max as long as it's not being recorded.
Disconnected.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're recording.
The recording.
Oh,
is,
sorry.
There.
It's the kind of thing that a TV news producer
You
should
know.
have thought about. Well, I guess I don't really have to actually upload it.
Yola? I guess.
Good. That working? Not on? Nope. Turned off.
Well, can you
1, 2,
just
3,
talk
4,
about-
5,
I'll get
5,
back
4,
to
3,
you
2,
next
1.
time.
Cool. Good. So Chris.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you use interviews in your work?
Well, broadly speaking, God, that's loud. Okay. Broadly speaking, I do a lot of long form pieces, so I interview lots and lots and lots of people, dozens and dozens per story. It's, 3,000 word piece, I might interview 40, 50 people for. I tend to overdo it, so. And I do lots of profiles of people, so I spend a lot of time with somebody over the course of days. I try to, in a sense, move in with them almost, if I can. Really, and I've actually been invited to live in people's houses. I have, seriously. It's true. And occasionally I'll do a Q&A with somebody. I'm not really a cultural reporter, but I do a lot of cultural stuff, and so occasionally the Q&A it can be the best form of an interview. I know that's probably not totally applicable for everybody here, but sometimes if the person is really well spoken, then it's a great form to stick with, I think, as opposed to a story.
And how long are the interviews that you usually do? Do you do like 10-minute interviews with the 50 people? Do you do like 4 hours interviews?
It depends on who they are. It depends on what they're willing to offer. If it feels like they're offering the same material that I've already heard 6 times, then it's a 2-minute interview. And if it's the prime subject, then it could be many, many hours. Yeah, many hours. Like I'm trying to think of a story I did last summer, maybe where I ended up interviewing the main subject, probably, I don't know, close to 17, 18 hours. Wow. Yeah, so you fill up digital recorders pretty quickly, actually. And what about you?
So TV's a little bit different. We do a bunch of different kinds of interviews. I mean, it depends on the story that I'm working on. Sometimes I have to do a lot of breaking news stories that are, quick turnaround. And because I work at the network level, we deal with people all over the country. So sometimes I have to do the very awkward thing of talking to somebody through a phone while they're staring at a camera, or not staring at a camera. They're trying to stare at that point on the wall, if you guys are the camera, and that just makes things really challenging. Those can be really fast things. Other times I'll go and I'll do profiles. I worked at Nightline, and we do 7-minute pieces, and I've done 4 or 5 hour interviews before, which can be a pain to go through later. It's a lot of material to get. But
To cut down to what? To cut down to, for Nightline, a 7-minute piece. For Nightly or World News, it can be a 2-minute piece. So, there's a lot of stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor. I've both footage and interviews, but I've probably had 6 hours of interviews before for a 2-minute piece, which can suck. You wanted to ask me this, but I'm going to ask you first instead. I like this question. What do your favorite interviews have in common? The interviews that you've been part of, what are your, not interviews in general, but the ones you've been involved with?
I think it's usually, for us in broadcast, I think one of the things that's so important is that you get sort of emotional content. You get stuff where you really connect with somebody, whether it's whatever that emotion is. I think that's probably true in print too, but I think it's so visceral for us in broadcast that when you hear somebody's voice, when you hear pain, when you hear sadness, when you hear anger, when you hear outrage, when you hear joy, those are they're such palpable things that all of the interviews have that and something unexpected, something that I wasn't aware of either about the person or about the world, hopefully, in the best case scenarios.
Yeah, that's true. I think probably the interviews I like the best are the ones that in a way will go off the subject a little bit, maybe slightly. It'll seem like they're going off the subject, but actually they're talking about the same subject. I realize this might seem a little vague and abstract, but if I'm talking to you about I don't know, you did terribly in a class or something, you might suddenly start relating it to something else in your life and then kind of circle it back to the class. That's how people talk a lot of times. You know, they sort of go off on tangents and come back. I love interviews like that. It's tricky for space, obviously, but it can say a lot about a person. And ultimately, you know, depending on the story you're doing, you want the interview to say a lot about the person, which sounds really obvious, but it's not. I mean, we'll go more into that.
I think people who speak in analogies is really helpful a
Yeah,
lot of times. Like that's
exactly.
that's the way that you can condense. You know, I mean, it's not something that we can do, but hopefully we get to questions that that will condense that kind of a tangent into something which is really tied into the story. I mean, I get, you know, one of my sort of average pieces on the nightly news is going to be 250 words, including all the quotes and things. So, you know, whatever kind of exposition we're trying to do has to fit in a really short amount of time. So
I don't know how you do that, actually.
I don't know how you do what you do on the flip side. It's a funny thing that, you know, we've got this dichotomy, and you guys probably work in different lengths too. I guess, you know, let's go to how do you convince someone to talk to you? I mean, you've done a lot of pieces with either, I mean, there's the booking of like a celebrity or a politician or a, you know, a big sort of personality, and then there's the ordinary people. Are there tricks that you have?
For ordinary people, or well, obviously, if it's a well-known person, I've done a lot of profiles of very well-known people. Very well. Name anybody. Let's see if do we play this game here, actually? Name anybody. Just throw out a name. Anyone.
Elon Musk?
Yes, I've interviewed him. Yes, I have. Anyway.
But you have a rather unconventional approach to booking celebrities, for example. You were telling me a story about somebody who was in a show in Chicago, and you just went to go see him, right?
Yeah, I knew he was in the show. You guys know Michael Shannon as the actor? He was on Boardwalk Empire. He's kind of he's a very big part of the Chicago theater scene, even though he's a well-known person. I knew he was in a show. I knew he was rehearsing. Rather than go through his publicists at all, I just went to the theater and waited for him to come outside and smoke, which I knew he would. And he was, and I said, you know, hey, we want to do a piece on you, and we'd like to spend time, you know, a lot of time with you, and I'd like to, you know, spend a lot of time with you, actually, this summer before he was in the Superman movie, I think a few years ago. And I don't like doing celebrity interviews, but I like them when their person is interesting. You know, like you were saying about the problem with the athlete interview. But the same problem with celebrity interviews, they often have nothing to say. But if you can get them to say something a little bit different, if you can kind of put them in a different situation. I'm kind of getting off subject here a little bit. Well, how do you pick who you interview, basically?
I think it depends on the story. I mean, I think if, you know, in terms of researching who I interview, like I tend to have, I'm a big believer in Rolodexes or contact lists. And so on slow days, I literally, you know, because I cover general news, I used to I have about 5,000 contacts that are in my contacts, and I just, most of them I've spoken with at least once. But on slow days, I would actually just really go through the website of the Kennedy School of Government faculty and look for people who have expertise on anything I think might be useful at some point, and I would just cut and paste them into my contacts. Anytime.
Do you ever interview people that want to be interviewed?
Oh yeah, I mean.
Really?
Media whores.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people like that in the world, and some of them are, you know, some of them are just really good at very quickly distilling information, and that's an important thing for us, and are willing to get on the subway and come up to Rock Center or come up to Lincoln Center on a moment's notice and go on camera. So a lot of times for us, the interview is actually just generally about, sometimes it's about just finding who we can actually get to fast enough and who's available, and other times it's about picking the person with the most expertise.
It's funny you're saying that because I'm thinking, that, to answer the last question, I think almost everybody I do a piece on is somebody I have to convince to do the interview. I mean, in a way. Often they, you know, I'm not interested in if they have something to promote. I want to do the story, not when they're in the middle of a press junket or anything. We're actually not allowed to do press junkets at my paper. Even though it's, you know, we own the LA Times and they do tons of them. So anyway, yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of times the best interviews for me are the ones where you do have to kind of convince somebody to talk to you. And we can talk a little bit, if you guys want, about how to convince people to talk to you, but that's very tough.
How do you convince people to talk to you?
How do I convince them? I mean, as you guys can all see, I'm somewhat of I guess, needy, vulnerable person, right? So, that helps a little bit, right? And this hat, which is stupid, and I wear it all the time, I wear it in my column photo, even though it's in Chicago, and people hate it. But I wear it, and people recognize me by that. But it makes them probably feel, I don't know, maybe there's like a degree of, I don't seem as professional to them, which is really good, I think. Because you set, no, really, it's like if they come at you with fewer expectations in a way, then it helps. It can help. It can help you. It's like a Trojan horse in a way. If you seem to be a babe in the woods, and they are willing to, I think, sometimes open up to you a little bit more.
I think there's also, I mean, it depends on the context, right? Like
Yeah,
if
totally,
you're going into a
totally
boardroom
fair.
and you're going to a corporate environment and dressing up in a suit will actually pay off, which is something I never do. And if you're going to a crime scene, the sort of more you can look like a normal person, the better. And the more time, and we've talked a lot about this, the more time that you can spend just, actually getting to know somebody or trying to sort of talk through things with them. I think especially with ordinary people meaning not figureheads or celebrities, but the more time you can spend getting to know them and letting them know that you aren't expecting that they have to give you a yes, but understanding what you mean from it. Making sure that they actually understand the consequences of doing an interview, I think is really important. I think, I think about, we have 9 million viewers on any given day, and people who are talking about sensitive information are rightly nervous about that sometimes. Some of them are in a state of shock and just don't think about it. Don't think about what's it going to mean if I go on TV and my kid is with me, and what is that going to mean? So I sort of try and make sure that everybody understands the process of what it means to be interviewed that might not otherwise know that.
Yeah. I mean, do you sign contracts?
No. You mean with interviewees?
Mm-hmm.
No, in almost no circumstances. I was on set at House of Cards last year, and they made me, that got lawyered to death. So we had like a giant non-disclosure agreement and stuff, and that was a huge pain in the butt. But no, not normally. And we don't even, for television news purposes, and I assume for you guys too, but we don't do things like release forms. We generally don't have to do release forms even with minors or anybody that we're interviewing, because
Yeah, we don't sign anything that says we won't ask these questions or we won't,
Yeah.
or what we'll ask. We don't negotiate the kinds of questions we're going to ask with people, although it comes up all the time.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's like an informal thing. Like you could say, this is what I'm planning to talk to them about. But if I were you, to maintain the credibility, I would never agree to not asking something.
Yeah.
In a way.
They also
That's
very
tricky.
often will want a list of questions in advance, which I'm sure you guys deal with this all the time too, and I'm hoping that you guys all have the same policy of, not
give
providing
them-
questions in advance,
don't
not
give them
letting them
questions.
review things, and not leaving things off the table.
Here's what I'll do though, occasionally with that, is I won't give them a list of questions, but I'll say, here's some of the things I want to talk to you about.
Exactly.
That's it. Usually that's enough. That's plenty. I think they just want to kind of feel like we're all on the same page or something like that. Although, you guys have seen Spotlight. That's a good line in that movie, actually.
And how do you think that's different with PR people, though?
What do you mean? Like how about?
In terms of
how to agree to the story?
Yeah.
I think PR people are really easy in a lot of cases. They tend to, I think it's like you can kind of say, this is what I want to do the piece on, and they, I don't know. I don't think it's that hard, really. I just never signed an agreement on anything, and I used to work at. Does anybody here remember Premiere Magazine? I bet you don't. You're too young. It was a movie magazine. It was like the Rolling Stone of movie magazines. It died maybe 10 years ago. So I worked there for a little while, and they would go through contract negotiations with like Tom Cruise and stuff like that, and it was cheesy. I thought it was a really bad thing to do. Like, you're not supposed to do that, really. You shouldn't. Anyway, sorry.
So I'm going to ask you, how do you order your questions? How do you start?
This is going too slow. Just like move on, everyone. Move on. Go ahead. Sorry.
How do you start it? How do you decide what your opening question is going to be?
So I definitely never pick an obvious question for my opening question. I always try to pick something that seems a little bit, in a way, it's like you want to start the conversation, middle of the conversation. You know, you don't want to start from when were you born. You want to start from something that's maybe a little bit off kilter, but somewhat related, something really personal. Hopefully, it really depends on the story. Do you want to? Should we show the clip?
Yeah.
So I did an interview several years ago with Sarah Silverman, the comedian. And this was the start, this is the very beginning of the Q&A with her. And it's actually not a bad way of... So this is basically, I mean, I'm picking something that is, everybody knows about her, right? But I'm trying to kind of relate it to something that you might feel like, oh, I should ask that, right? In other words, you know that she's very sunny and it's kind of a front for something else. So in a way, try to place that in some kind of a real situation. Like, how would you feel if somebody comes to you and they're fun and happy, but they're actually full of shit in a way? How does that translate to their real life? I'm not sure if that's the answer. Okay.
How do you generally come up with your questions otherwise?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing I always do is if you feel like the question is going to get a yes or no answer, in other words, if it is or are or do, if it starts that way, never ask it. Really never ask it until you're farther into the interview maybe. But try to always never ask a question that you think is going to get a one-word answer, because that's really tough. So you ask how or whys, you know. You can always reframe a question as a how or why, I think, as opposed to is or are. And it might sound really super obvious, but trust me, when you go interview people, you'll get them to open up more by just the simple change of the first word that you use. Because people don't want to really talk to you sometimes. If you know, even the people that agree, they don't want to talk sometimes, and they want to, you know, they want to kind of stonewall you.
I also think, I think research is one of the other big things that you can really do. I mean, just as much time as you have, which may be no time, but as much time as you have, look for anything that the person has said about what you're talking to them about before, and just look for, you know, think about anything that's missing from the conversation in a profile or something. If people know who Sarah Silverman is, read everything that she said so that you can find something that she hasn't. If you know, if you're looking to an expert to explain something, just make sure that you're thinking like whoever it is that you're writing for or that you're producing for. You know, just put yourself in the shoes of the audience and try and figure out what they would want to hear.
I would say one thing too is if you're going to do a long form piece on something, or if you're just interviewing somebody at length for even a news story, obviously this might sound really obvious, but do as much research as you can about that person and just start making a list of questions and try to not ask any questions that they've been asked to some extent. I would say I would try to leave those out, or sometimes I'll do two questions, so the list of obvious questions and then the list of questions that I kind of really want to ask, you know, and then you tend to splice those two things as you're going.
I also think, you know, it's important to keep the list of questions, but not actually look at it.
Yeah, right.
So I just think of it as a checklist. And so when I'm sitting there, you know, if there's a long pause, I also throw in some questions that I really couldn't care less about. Very often things that I suspect that they're going to want to talk about, so that they'll go on for a long time, and I can make sure that I actually have time to check my own notes, especially when, one of the toughest things is when you're dealing with an interviewee who's got a really tight schedule, and they're about to kick you out of the room, or if you're just working on a really tight deadline and you have a 5:30 interview and your deadline is 6:30, for example. And in those cases, you know, I take notes. Even if I'm doing the interview, I will have somebody else come with me to sit in the room if it's a really tight deadline to take notes on what I'm saying, or if the reporter that I'm working with is doing the on-camera reporter that's doing the interview, if they're doing it, I'm taking notes the whole time, and I'm standing by the camera and looking at the counter, so that everything you can do to sort of save yourself time when you're working under the gun is really important.
I'll actually, if we're not dealing with visuals but print or words, obviously, I ask a question or two that I don't care the answer to at all, especially if I want to detail what he's wearing, what they're wearing, what the room looks like, if it smells, if it's hot in there, whatever, you know, any detail. A lot of times if you don't have a ton of time with somebody, or even if you do, you want to kind of get their general vibe, like, are they nervous? Do they seem comfortable? Are they cocky? Whatever. So it's good to throw out like a question, just something that you don't really care that much about, and let them answer it. And if they're good, if they're somewhat long-winded, then you buy yourself a ton of time really early on just to kind of catch details. And it's super, I mean, these are the kind of things like you just learn as you do it a lot, you know, so,
Yeah.
you know.
I also, one other thing that we both do in common is we transcribe everything. I mean, as long as we have time to. Again, that's, you know, for me, so many things are deadline. But if I have a long interview, and I know you've talked about this too, if I transcribe everything because there's probably something that I didn't remember while I was thinking of my next question, or while I was listening to what they were saying, or because the interview was too long. And a lot of times you find that those are some of the best things come out of the stuff that you kind of would have missed otherwise.
Or the inflection of somebody, the way somebody says something, it could be completely different than.
Or something comes up later on, you know, like you did an interview 2 years ago, and all of a sudden the person's in the news again, and you may actually have something there, and you don't want to have to go back and listen through 17 hours
right.
again.
Transcription services, or as we call them, interns, they don't, you know, they don't necessarily put that this person said this word softer than the word before it, which matters. And, you know, depending on how they're saying something. So just as an example. So yeah, I would say you try to build in transcription time, which is horrible if you have 17 hours of interviews for a single story. And obviously it doesn't work if the story's on a deadline, but I guess in some cases I'm talking about stories where I'm working on them for a long time. Do you ever use silence?
Yeah. I mean, I think silence is one of the big, you know, like the sort of, if you have an awkward silence in a conversation, that prompts people. I mean, I think we've talked about this, but it prompts people to say things, because it's really, and you just keep looking at them, and it prompts them to say something else and something else and something else. And at some point it stops working. Diane Sawyer is really famous for doing that in ways that just, you know, for doing that in ways that produce really good stuff. But at some point you end up with a pause that's just really weird, and then you stop it. How do you, I think we need to we should probably start moving on, but I think the one other question I really want to tackle is how do you ask the tough question? The question that sucks all the air out of the room, the one that's really scary and makes people sweat.
Sorry, this is just to keep us on track here so the time doesn't go up.
Checklist.
So I never, well, it depends on the person, but generally you don't ask it first, right? I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about that? Do you ask it first?
I guess it depends upon the situation. I think sometimes if it's clear that that's the only reason that you're going into the interview, sometimes it can be disarming. And like I think with almost anybody who's had any training, disarming them can be a good thing. Don't let them feel like they're under attack, but just say, listen, you know, I have to ask. Like, I just want to address the issue right away. And that'll put them more at ease in some ways. And you can always ask them again at the end.
Often they want to talk about it too, because they know it's underneath every question you have, so it'd be better just to kind of get it out there on the table.
I also sometimes, you know, that's again, like I try and put myself into their shoes and think, what is a way that I could get them to think about this naturally? Like, you know, if there's I'm trying to think of a good example right now. Give me an example of a tough question.
A tough question?
Anybody throw one out.
Why do you beat your wife?
Okay, so I might think about, do they know that I'm asking them that? They know that that's going to be up there. They know that it's out there. So that actually probably is a case where I probably would just start. If there's some video that's come out, I would probably just say, you know, this video is out there. You know that it's out there. You know that that's why we're sitting down. I want to ask you this. But afterward, I would say, but do you, you know, and they would say something about loving their wife and, you know, sorry that it happened and things. And afterwards, I would give them a chance to really talk about that. And then I would try to find a way to connect that to another thought.
Yeah. Sorry to like interrupt here. I guess I'm thinking of like a specific instance where it's like I'm talking to my college president, for example, about our investments that Davidson has, and it's like I know she knows that we have these investments, but it's like
investments meaning things that some students want divestment from.
Yeah.
Okay. Like oil.
Fossil fuel divestment. Hey, you know, awesome. And so it's just like, it's like how do you get her to like talk about like how this is unethical and how it's not it's like misaligned with our mission as a college, and like get her to actually have an opinion on that and say like, because she has her like PC like pre-scripted thing that she wants to say, but it's like I know like there's more than that.
One thing I would do is I would think about, I mean, her message probably has to do with, you know, we have to raise money, here's what we do with the money, and, you know, we would like to sort of limit exposure as much as we can, but, you know, and we obviously have commitments to green issues and all sorts of things on our campus, right? So give her a chance to talk about those things first, make it clear that you are not there to just attack her, but say, you know, this is obviously really, I would just say, you know, this is obviously a really complicated issue. I know that, you know, finances are tough right now. It's a tough economy. Can you talk a little bit about the financial constraints on the university? Then I would sort of give her an opportunity to say, as long as you know she's not going to walk out of the room at some point, you know, then you say, obviously a lot of students feel like this is a major issue because of the environmental impact that's going to impact us as students in the future when we, you know, as we grow older and as our kids grow older. I know that this is something that Davidson has done a lot to address. Can you talk about that? And then, you know, just sort of try and build her trust and make it clear that your job is not to be her enemy. And then hopefully when you ask her the question, you can grill her a little bit because you've built up a little bit of a rapport. But think about what she's thinking in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I also say that if you have any kind of connection to the question in any way, in other words, if you're impacted somehow, I don't think it's a crime to say, you know, this is kind of how, this, you know, I understand what you're going through. I understand why you might be uncomfortable with this question, or I understand because this has happened to me in my life, or, you know, it's sort of, again, I'm sorry, I realize my example is kind of abstract, but if you can kind of show some vulnerability to the person you're interviewing, it's not a bad thing, you know. You don't want to you know, you don't want to give up everything to them, obviously, for yourself. But you want to be able to kind of, I think it's not a bad thing to show that you're a person too. You're not just you said like, I'm not here to just attack you. I would say leave out the just. I'm not here to attack you.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the perception. Just let them know the perception is that.
Right.
By asking them the questions. But.
Right. I just want this to be clear. I want this to be explained as clear as possible. I would say that if it's something that's, you know, how does this impact them personally? I mean, you could kind of move beyond that question. You know, how you know, why if you're answering these kind of vague PC terms, okay, that's fine. But I mean, don't ask the question this way. But say, you know, what does that mean to you personally, exactly? Like, you know, can you give me an example? It's not wrong to say, you know, can you give me a very specific example? That can be a dead end if they have a ton of media training and they're just, you know, they're basically taught not to give up anything. But I think generally, I think it's not bad if you can make it as personal as possible. I think that's really good. And I don't mean tell them exactly how you feel about the subject, but yeah.
Do you want to? Are there? I think we should probably move on for the sake of time. Do you want to go through some of the other examples of things that we have here?
You have stuff too, right?
Yeah.
You do.
Do you want to skip ahead to video? Do you want to talk about some of these things?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if we're missing any questions here. I know you guys, we're going to leave questions for you guys because I'm sure you have a bunch. Yeah, why don't we go through? I pulled out a couple of examples. I don't want you to read everything because it's just going to be too much to read. But I tried to. Okay, so I did a profile of this chef in Chicago, Mindy Siegel, who she has a reputation for being a real hard ass, and she's a very difficult person.
Christine, are we not supposed to swear on on this recording?
She's very, very difficult, and
difficult in what way?
She's hard on her staff. I guess that's a cliche of a chef, but she's also tough with press. She won't talk to them a lot of times. She won't sit for interviews. I think you clicked the next part.
I did. You want me to?
Yeah. So she's really. So it was hard to kind of get her to sit down in the first place for an interview for a while, but then once she actually sat down, she revealed that in the past year she'd been in and out of sort of mental health facilities at least twice. She had attempted suicide. She was a lot of the anxiety that is built around her, that is built around her reputation, is kind of coming from a place. This sounds like, no offense to the Diane Sawyer kind of thing, but.
And why did you call her the oversharer?
Because she tended to, I mean, maybe this is not the best example, but I think there's another thing.
Do you want to go through?
Yeah, go to the next one. Yeah, okay. I called her the oversharer because at some point she didn't want to talk, but then she ended up giving up everything in a huge way, because really, like, she didn't want to talk because she, in a way, did want to talk, right? She didn't want to, she wasn't interested in talking.
And how did you get her there?
How did I get her there? I got her there by going to her restaurant and eating in her restaurant, and then asking to see her afterwards, and, you know, hey, the food was really good tonight, that kind of thing. Can we talk at some point about, you know, about you? We'd really like to do a profile. We've done lots of profiles of male chefs. We've never really done a lot about female chefs.
So you made it clear that you cared about the things that she cared about.
Yeah, know everything you can about the person, and I don't mean be an ass kisser, but I mean, make sure they know that you understand where they're coming from, and it doesn't mean you agree with them. It just means that you're essentially on the same page. Oh, did I give you a bad? Okay, the ignorer. So this is this is kind of classic celebrity interview stuff. So I interviewed Christopher Walken and Pacino together once, and I would throw out questions, and then they would just talk to each other. And that's, like, in a way, depending on the story, that's the best interview ever, because you get really what they're like. In a way, they were just ignoring me. That's why I call them the ignorer.
But so that's what you ended up using, was the sound just from them.
A lot of the story is them talking to each other, not to me. And I would kind of throw out a quick question. See, and the question was, you guys ever feel taken for granted, right? So you kind of, in a way, you're appealing to somebody's vanity. That's not a bad thing in an interview. You know, how do you think they feel wherever they are at this point in their career? If they're an athlete on the downslide, you know, or they're on the upslide, it's like you kind of try to put yourself in their shoes a little bit and think, you know, how would I feel right at this moment? And then, I mean, I would go there, ask the really uncomfortable question. Yeah, keep going. George Saunders. Does anybody know George Saunders, the writer? So I spent days with George Saunders, and he's a really, the reason I call it, I just put it in the generous, because, you know, so it's a really good thing if you're doing a profile of somebody, I would say to put them in a car. So you guys have all seen the Jerry Seinfeld thing, right? There's a really good reason that works. I mean, you guys are stuck in a car for a certain amount of time. There's traffic. You have to kind of talk. One of them, you can't get out of the car, really.
It's like the silence in a way.
It's like the silence. It kind of forces people to be in a I mean, I think if you can interview somebody in a car, it's a great thing. The only problem is you've got to figure out a way to take notes, and they have to agree to tape, obviously. You can't do longhand. Although I've done both.
Do you always record
interviews? Yeah.
And do you take notes as well?
Yes. But
what do you?
You mean do I take notes on the interview? No. Well, sometimes I'll write down keywords. A lot of times, just a keyword. If they say something that jumps out to me, I'll write that down.
Have you ever had a recorder fail?
Early on, early on, like when I first started, right out of college, I had I was using a tape, like an actual tape, and the batteries were almost dead, and so the tape was real slow, and you could barely hear the recording. And I remember taking the tape home and playing it in a stereo, and turning it up to 10, so that, and it was just hiss, and it was a disaster.
And what do you do now if your recorder were to fail in your next interview? What would you do?
What would I do? I would probably write around it if I can. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So you're not quoting them. You can't quote them. You have to figure out a way to write about them without quoting them, it happens, definitely.
This is something we don't have to deal with.
Yeah.
If our tape fails, there's no peace.
Does everybody record their interviews here? Yeah. Okay.
Do you guys also take notes?
Yeah. How do you record your interviews? I'm just curious. Like, how do you physically do it? Phones? And do you put it on the table or wherever? Yeah, don't do that. Do this. Do this. See, imagine this is the recorder, right? Put it under your notes and then write. Just even if you're not really taking notes, just doodle, whatever. Just put it underneath so they don't see the recorder. if you see the recorder, it tends to make them a little more nervous, trust me. It makes people more nervous. I mean,
This is probably if you're interviewing people older than you.
Yeah.
I think it's probably
definitely.
one condition
No, I
for
think
it.
that's true of like anyone, really. In some, I just habitually do it now. Yeah, I mean, I did a profile of do you guys know Tabby Gevinson? You guys know her? Okay, so I spent several days with her too. I watched her clean her bedroom one day. It's creepy, but it's true. And I remember her at some point saying, "How are you getting all this? Like, how are you getting any of this?" And she didn't know I'd been recording it the entire time. I mean, I asked her early on, but she kind of forgot about it because you just end up being with the person so long. Anyway,
We don't really have that luxury if we've got 15 lights set up and cameras, and that's a pain. Does anybody here work with video at all? Or audio? Video? Okay. So a couple of you guys. I think some of the principles here are the same. I mean, just in terms of, I think a lot of times people have a tendency, especially young reporters in the newsroom, have a tendency to use quotes that sort of feel like they're from a press release, right? Like it's something, it's either factual, it may be strongly stated, but it's just a statement that you don't need that person for. So I just wanted to share a couple of things that are better examples in my mind. These are all pretty short. This is about the end of Sex and the City, and this is a woman named Susanna Walters, who's a feminist scholar.
All four of them evolved.
Miranda got a heart, Charlotte gets a brain, and Samantha gets courage. And they all get their happiness, and of course Carrie gets Manhattan and gets to go home with her Wizard of Oz, Mr. Big.
And so that's just, that's the analogy that we're talking about. This is sort of, something that we get made fun of in television news for using sound bites that are that sort of pithy, but it's really short. It gives you a sense of what she's talking about, and it's colorful. So I think that's one thing that we look for in almost any story. And people who are able to do that this is obviously feature, but people who can do that with news stories too are even better. If you can talk about climate change rather than talking about parts per billion, you can talk about the size of a building or volume of whatever. If you can find a way to illustrate that in a way that people will get very quickly, that's one thing we're always looking for.
super important to say I don't understand what you mean.
Yeah,
I mean, really. I mean, I know, like, I'm just as bad about this as anybody, but you want them to think that you get it, you understand what they're talking about, even if you don't understand what they're talking about. But be dumb. I mean, really, you have to, in a way. You have to just ask the really stupid question, which...
Sometimes they get annoyed by that, and if they do, you can say, look, I just want to make sure that my mom's going to understand this. Or I use the mom example all the time. You guys might, I don't know if you do that, but just say, I totally hear what you're saying, and I really appreciate your trying to break this down for me, but if I told my mom that, she wouldn't understand. So I need your help. She's smart, she's curious, she's educated, but she doesn't know a thing about what you're talking about.
Right.
So how would you tell this to your mom?
Exactly. Or I always say my grandmother, actually. That's why I use my grandmother. Make sure my grandmother understands if she reads this or something. Yeah. I mean, you don't want them to dumb it down, but in a way, it's like, that's a fair thing to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is actually, like, Ted Koppel famously, you guys know who he's, when he hosted Nightline, he got asked by somebody, sat in the chair and said, how much do you want me to dumb this down? And he said, I don't. Like, I want you to talk to a really smart 10th grader and just explain it to them. So, which I think is a great way of looking at it.
But let me just point out that academics, or particularly at universities, it can be deadly. It can be really hard. I mean, they're not going to speak in sound bites a lot of times. That's good, that's good. They'll give you a lot of background, but a lot of times they're just terrible in interviews.
Sometimes that's also why, like, anytime I see somebody on TV or even read a pithy quote in the Times or something, I'll take down that name. Like, that's when I usually tear out a piece of paper and I take it with me and I look them up and look up their contact information and stick them in my contacts. And like when you find somebody, like there's a guy named Tom Watson, I think, at NASA, who is the most incredible person at explaining anything having to do with climate change. And he makes it so understandable and fun. It's really weird. I don't understand, like, no other climate scientist seems to be able to do that, so he's the one that I'm going to call all the time from now on, especially for TV.
Have you ever insulted somebody in an interview? Like, inadvertently, or... I mean, I have lots, actually. I was just, no, you're saying that, I was just thinking, I interviewed this University of Chicago economist about a year ago, and he was trying to explain something to me, and I just did not understand the way he was explaining it. I really didn't get it. And he kept explaining it, and he was getting frustrated. And it was as if like we were talking two different languages, because we were. And he was just getting really irritated, and then he said, look, I don't understand what you don't understand about this, and because he just would not break it down in a real, and I said to him, he looked really young, I said, how old are you? And it was just like the worst thing to say, because he looked younger than a lot of you guys, and clearly it was like the uncomfortable thing probably in his office is that he looks like he's 12 and he works, you know, and it kind of stopped him dead in his tracks, and he actually right then started to.
And what did you do?
What do you mean, what did I do?
What
I
did
didn't
you do?
apologize.
You didn't apologize?
No. No, I just said, how old are you? I said, well, I'm just curious, because obviously, I'm reading. I want
So
to be
in
able
terms
to
of
mention
offering advice to you guys as journalists, I'm gonna just keep on moving through the crowd. I don't know. But anyway,
I think it's good sometimes. I really do. I think it throws people off a little bit. I mean, the Channing Tatum thing we talked about.
I think this is a very personality-based thing. But this is another example I wanted to share with you guys. Like, one other reason to use sound, it's certainly for us in video, but one other reason to use a character or a quote or something is when the quote itself just has so much character, and this was one example I remember.
So your chances of being hit by a piece of space debris are too small to calculate. Unless, of course, you happen to be Lottie Williams of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
On the left shoulder, it hit me right back here. And it rolled down to the ground and fell.
Ms. Williams holds the distinction of being the only human being ever hit by a piece of space junk. This little burnt piece from a used American rocket. She was completely unhurt, though perhaps a bit disappointed.
I was thinking I had something celestial, you know. Here I got something man-made, you know, nobody even knows anything about it.
There is absolutely no reason to use that quote, except that she's so completely delightful that she makes that whole piece.
Well, can I ask you guys, what do you think is the best part of that quote? Like, what's the word that would keep that quote in there? I mean, exactly.
It's also the way she said it.
Yeah, it's just a good word.
Emotion, obviously, is another. This is a piece that we did a couple of years ago on
We
Memorial
will
Day.
never forget the terrible loss you have suffered. Mr. Bush singled out 8-year-old Christian Golzinski, whose picture, taken in April at his father's funeral, resonated all over the world. He managed to be brave while he held his father's folded flag. Afterwards, Christian told us he was excited about the honor, but still very sad about his father.
It's still kind of close and not the best.
And that's partly just an example of why I love TV, because like that expression on his face, and I mean, we fight for literally every second in a short news piece, and that expression, the sigh, for me is what makes that. And there's just, I ended up doing another piece about him 8 years later, just because I wondered what happened to him, because he has stuck with me so much. I'm going to show you guys, I'm going to skip ahead on this one.
Can I ask one quick question to that? You obviously have permission from the parents.
Yes.
Let's just
she was sitting right there, yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. So I guess you probably know this instinctively, to not talk to children or make sure the parents can, okay, not everybody knows that.
Yeah, that's true. This is just an example of sometimes you have to think around how you're going to deal with something. And this is a story, I'll just play the clip first.
He was a healthy 12-year-old growing up in South Africa when he went home sick from school one day.
He never ever got better.
His body weakened, he lost control of his muscles, stopped communicating. Doctors believed it was a neurodegenerative disease and told his parents he was unaware of the world around him. But that was wrong. For nearly a decade, he says he was awake, but no one noticed.
For so many years I was like a ghost. It was like I wasn't there. I was invisible.
This is Martin today. And this is how you communicate now.
Yes.
He speaks by typing into a computer that voices his words. Because that takes time, we gave him some of our questions in advance. You must have overheard so many conversations.
Yes, many times. You'll get to see and hear things that you probably never would. Things like what people really think and how they really are when nobody is watching.
Like one night when he heard his mom in a moment of despair.
I said to him one day, I hope you die. And I had no idea that he understood that. And I'm very, very sorry I said it.
While I was very sad and upset by what she said, I understood where that was coming from. My mother often felt that she wasn't a good mom, and one of the hardest things for me was I couldn't tell her that, no, you are doing great. She is a good mother.
So I just wanted to share that because for us, there are a couple of things about that. One is that obviously he has this computer-assisted voice, and so we had to figure out how we were going to do that because every follow-up question that we asked took probably 10 or 15 minutes to respond to because he has to input everything letter by letter. He can use his hands and he can use most of his upper body, but he still doesn't have control over his voice, and he's in a wheelchair. So those are the two things. So that was a really complicated thing for us to figure out. And then once we, in this case, we did provide the questions in advance, which ethically we have to address that. So that's why those were the two things that I wanted to point out. But there are ways to creatively get around sort of anything that that you're dealing with in an interview.
Did you say that in the story? That
yeah, that was
provided? Oh, it was, okay.
And fortunately in a way that felt conversational and natural. So I think we definitely want to open up for questions here right now. I guess in terms of timing the questions, we can keep talking a little more. We can answer a lot of questions. I would just ask you guys, we can do a little bit of role play. Do you want to do that, or would you rather sort of take our remaining time and do
We have some
more
scenarios.
talking?
You guys are, you're thinking dirty thoughts when you say role playing. It sounds
Majority wins, show of hands. Who wants to do some sort of role play? Oh, we'll skip that. Awesome. Then this is great. Now I didn't need to rush. I'm going to show one more example then. So this is the other thing. I think there are just times, it's an example of, I'll just show it first.
5-year-old Jacob LeMay is fierce. He loves karate and dogs and spaceships and playing with his sisters.
So 2 sisters and you're the brother, right?
Yeah.
Were you always the brother?
I'm not always.
Where were you before?
They're my sister.
How come it changed?
Because I wanted to be a boy.
So A, that's probably not very unexpected given the fact that I wrote the unexpected on the top, so, which I thought about not using. But that was just a case, there's a couple of things. One of them is that I think we deliberately structured our story that way because we wanted it to be a little bit of a reveal for our audience. And the other thing about this interview, it's really tough talking to kids. And especially like 8-year-olds, I think is sort of the sweet spot where they start to actually, an interview might be feasible. Like 4 and 5-year-olds, it's really hard. And so in this case, we left the camera running, but we walked out of the room. And so we had a cable running out all the way. And so I was in the next room looking at a monitor very quietly, and his mom and I were sitting there and watching on the monitor, and the cameraman came in with me, and we were all just sort of sitting there watching to see what happened, and Kate just talked to him. And so you have to do it, and we wanted to make sure that we were down on his level and in the room with him, and whatever you can do. It's the same thing with grown-ups. You want to get them as comfortable as you can, but for kids especially, that was what we had to do. And we spent Kate spent probably like 15 minutes just talking to him before we got to anything that was usable in that situation. Should we open for some questions?
You guys want to do questions? You don't really want to do any role playing? I'm disappointed.
Did you guys have questions?
Yeah, I think this was mentioned a bit before, but when dealing with administrators who maybe do have media training and are told to stick to certain talking points, something I run into a lot is like I've got 30 minutes for an interview and they spend like 10 minutes responding to one question about like, how great Harvard is doing at this one thing, and I'm not interested in any of it. Are there like polite ways to cut people off, essentially?
That's a good question. Yeah, there are. I mean, I think so. I think you kind of...
He also thinks that it's polite to call somebody really young and then not respond to it.
I would say, I would just quietly kind of interrupt and say, listen, I'm sorry, we just have a certain amount of time, so I'd like to kind of follow up. Or actually, maybe even better, and this I have done before, while they're in their ramble, do the thing where you don't really care about the answer. You just want to kind of you want to follow up the question. You want to follow up something that they're saying right in the middle of that ramble. So stop them and just ask them, and then it kind of pulls them out of the rhythm, and then they can kind of go back into, you can kind of ask another question.
Oh, that's interesting. Something unrelated, you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Or something related to what they're saying specifically right then, but it's super. In other words, I didn't hear that, or I didn't. Can you say that one more time? Just to pull them out of the rhythm, because people can kind of just, as you can tell from me, you like the sound of your own voice after a while.
I also think you can listen for you. I was going to say that you can listen for something that's connected in any way, because then it makes it their decision in a certain way. Oh, just listen for any. Like, do you have a specific example that you can recall?
Yeah, sure. So I was interviewing the Dean of Admissions for a story on regional diversity, and he, what was he talking about? He was going on and on about sort of this program they have where they send admissions officers all around the country and sort of, listing place after place after place. And I'd sort of gotten the idea like 5 minutes ago, but he's just sort of kept going and talking about how great the Los Angeles trip was and all this stuff.
Well, I would say don't. I mean, I don't mean to be mean to people, but I mean, don't be. Just be, be engaged to the point where, like, yeah, okay, I get that, but no. And then, in other words, you kind of, you know what I mean? Like, if you're saying this and this and this, and then okay, I understand. Don't say like, can we move on? I think just kind of ask the question right away. In other words, don't interrupt. Don't say excuse me. Just have it as a conversation. Like if you're talking to a friend, right, you're just gonna kind of like cut them off. Maybe at least I would.
Everything you can do to make it feel like a conversation again, I think is important.
That to me makes it more of a conversation than just. I mean, it's tough. Those are impossible interviews sometimes. I mean.
But what was the issue that you wanted to talk to them about diversity?
So it's like the story is regional diversity. So like where Harvard draws from the Northeast disproportionately and stuff like that.
Yeah. So then have that one stat. Make sure that you go into that situation with a stat about each place or something. So when he gives the example of LA, right, and it's the 14th example that he's giving you, you can say yes, thank you, but I do want to point out, like I think that that only 2.5% of people are actually from the West. So I appreciate you're giving me that example, but I wonder if we could talk about that. I mean, look for something that is a way in to what the question you really want to ask is. And then I think the interruption is fair and polite-ish. Maddie?
Speaking of media training, it's been pretty well documented. Like the Washington Post did a really good piece a couple of years ago about how the White House has 1 million interview minders and how it's so hard to get that lower level people even are not allowed to talk to the press without 3 PR people in the room and et cetera, et cetera. And we've certainly seen that all different corporations and definitely in higher education. In Harvard, I think we wrote a story a couple years ago about how our PR office has 55 people and every single dean has their own spokesperson and it's impossible to get an interview without one. I'm curious as to what extent you guys have seen that, observed that trend over your careers and the impact that's had, to what extent has it made access harder? Basically.
Can I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because Chris is better at getting around this than I am. So that's why I want to start. But celebrities, politicians, usually CEOs, for us, we're never going to be able to get around that. They are going to be in the room no matter what. Some of them, not all of them, but there are definitely some who you'll never get around that. And so when we interview, I've done interviews with Obama and Clinton and Bush, 4 of those. So in those situations, there's probably going to be 10 people in the room, if not more, which can be really weird. I mean, I think you count on 2 things. One is that person actually is comfortable in that environment more than other people would be. And the other thing is you try and block them. We have the advantage of setting up equipment, but once we set up the equipment and we set up the room, we set up the monitor, which all of those people are going to want to be able to look at out of eye shot so that they can't make eye contact with the person that they are repping. And we pull them as far away as possible. It might even work if you're the first one in a room, set up chairs, right? Just set a chair for them as far away as possible. And they may say, I'm going to move the chair closer, but do whatever you can to be non-confrontational about that. And if they try to start interrupting, sometimes a lot of times I'll sit there and sort of be making eye contact with the PR person while I work with a reporter, so the reporter is there and trying to do the interview, and I'm interacting with the PR person. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just be like, listen, you can address whatever you want to afterward, but just hold everything until the end.
Yeah, and I don't let the PR person there at all, almost ever. I've had them, yeah, I almost never will let a PR person sit in on an interview. I mean, I think it's maybe happened once or twice, but I mean, I'll kill an interview for that. And often they don't want to kill the interview, so they'll back down usually. I mean, I don't know, obviously as student journalists, it's a little bit probably different. You have less leverage, I suppose, but I would just be bold about it and just say, listen, I'm more comfortable. The truth is people won't, they would rather be talking to you directly and not to two other people who are sitting there in the room. I mean, it's self-conscious, unless they're really uncomfortable with the interview in the first place and they want somebody there to sort of hold them. But I never allow them to, I get, it's funny, it's a good question actually, because I one day I said to somebody at work, this is like a couple of years ago, I remember saying, I feel like every week now, and it's true, I think every week I have a conversation with somebody, usually a publicist, where I have to say to them, I don't work for you, right? Like you realize that I work for this newspaper, I don't work for you, I'm not a publicist myself, I'm not here to sell you, I have a job to do, it's a story, and I'm not being mean, it's just that, let's just be clear here, I'm not here to, I realize you have a job, but I also have a job, and in a way, my job's.
A lot of this is also, personality driven, obviously. I think that, I tend to be a little bit more deferential by my nature than you are, which I respect more about you, but I can't pull off most of the stuff that you can pull off.
I mean, it just depends.
But I think it's knowing yourself and figure out your best way of doing that, of standing up for yourself. And, for me, that's just blocking, like if there is eyesight, I just literally start to lean and just block the person as much as I can and just try and sort of shift my gaze so that they won't look at their PR person.
Yeah, I had somebody ask me recently, I was trying to set up an interview with somebody, and they said, I'd written about this person a little bit before, and they said, the last story you wrote wasn't that positive, really. I was like, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, I didn't realize that was a point, so, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to kind of say that. Do you feel like sometimes there's a gap in understanding between what the PR person thinks their role is and what reporters think the PR person's role is? And I guess how do you find not necessarily a middle ground, but just a better understanding on both ends, or at least on the PR person's end, of what you think they should be doing and how you achieve it?
Sure. I would just say, this sounds super obvious, but just be really professional about it and just be clear. I don't mean be like hard ass and rigid, but at the same time, just make sure they really understand what your role is and that you're here for a story, you're not here for them. I mean, I say this because I've seen so many interns that go out on stories or, young reporters who, they just, it's just like they're in a prone position the entire interview, and they come back with nothing, basically, because it's just, they're so worried about people not liking them or something, and fuck those people. Who cares what if they like you or not? You're not their friends. You're not, and believe me, you're not their friends, right?
I think some of it is also about just making sure they understand what you're actually trying to get, because sometimes their default answer is no.
Yeah.
And so, for us, as much as possible, it's our version of the coffee shop. Like, we try to do something that's not sit in the lit area, and we try and do something that's more casual, and there's always a guy with a giant camera walking backwards. So I don't know how true that is, but we always try to have something a little bit more natural so that they're not hot under the lights and stuff. And sometimes people don't want to give us that extra time. And I just try and say, I think that a lot of times these things are more natural and the pieces can be better, and that ultimately, look, I just want to be able to give people something that they're going to relate to. And I think that that's a more relatable scenario. So we need to talk about some of the real issues, but I also need a little bit of time to get some personality into it too.
I often find people will give you more time once you get into the room with them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, it's also the celebrities or the celebrities or the politicians or whoever it is, they're always inclined to give you time if they like you. Or if they're comfortable with you, and so they will supersede the PR people no matter what.
Always, yeah. They might say 10 minutes, and then it's like, you're there for
That's why
half
Bill
hour.
Clinton is always like 15 minutes late.
Right.
If that.
Wait. Sorry, oh, I'm sorry, did I?
We'll go here and then.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So this goes back to kind of my introduction question. So just wondering how you cover a subculture and a weird news with keeping it interesting, but also not making the subject seem like the traveling circus or just like relying too much on the weirdness. I mean, my example, kind of like why I'm asking this question is I was doing a piece on tarantula owners and an online community of tarantula owners.
That's great, I love that.
Yeah, when I wrote my draft, it was like a late night comedy show of just like too many like of the weird quirks like at one after another, and it's,
The subject.
yeah.
Yeah, right, and that's just weird.
Do you want your example? No, I think this is. Do you want to talk about furries?
Oh, furries. That's right. I'm sorry. That's funny. I wasn't even thinking of that. Yeah. Sorry, we were just talking about that. A couple of years ago, I did a piece on a furry bowling league in the suburbs of Chicago. And these, I mean, let's talk about, this is a group of people that never don't get any good press at all, right? I mean, just generally, they're seen as nutcases and sex addicts, right? Basically, like it's all about sex and whatever. So I found out about this, and I love that kind of story. I love the story where you have to like humanize the people who basically kind of get a. I mean, everybody has their reasons, right? So no matter what they're doing, no matter what subculture, they're often very normal people. They can be, you know. Anyway, I just went to them. They wouldn't respond to my emails for like 6 months, and then I just started showing up at their bowling nights, and they have total priority to not let me in, you know. So they didn't let me in, but I would hang outside, and they were wearing furry costumes, so they would inevitably have to leave the bowling alley, come outside and take the head off because it was too hot in the costume, and practical thing. And so I would just wait outside, and I started talking to them, and after a while, like I went back a few times. It's just a pain. It's a pain in the ass, you know. They meet on Saturday nights, and so you screw a lot of your nights, I suppose. But you know, it turned out great. Actually, they were fantastic. They eventually let me into their world, basically, and it's not a sex thing. It wasn't a sex thing at all. I mean, as far as, yeah, I mean, it really wasn't. It was just more like lonely people than anything. And I wrote about, you know, I thought it was. They loved the story later, and it wasn't a flattering story. I mean, they do seem like needy, weird people at times, but I think it was just somebody who.
But you said that you actually talked to them, and they actually said that they felt like it was a fair portrayal.
Yeah. They didn't think it was flattering, but they thought it was fair, and that was more than they ever get. So they're used to people having seen like CSI episode of furries or something like that, you know.
Kind of a follow-up to that. How did you know you could come to that point and say like, I can say that these people are just lonely, or I can say that maybe some like emotional factor is contributing to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just the time. I mean, I know it's a lame answer, but it's just, I mean, you spend so much time with people that you eventually feel like you know them a little bit. And, you know, it's not a bad thing to talk to them about how you feel about stuff. I mean, really, you should at some point. I mean, it depends on the kind of writing you're doing. Like, I tend to do pretty impressionistic stuff, but yeah.
I also think, I mean, just on that same point, and then we had a question over on that side, but on a similar point, I just think it's always important to try and get to know who your subjects are in whatever time period you have, and that even if you don't understand them, even if you have an impression about them, challenge yourself to break that impression. And, you know, I mean, I spent 10 years covering evangelical Christians who I respect enormously, and, you know, I mean, I was just open-minded, but it was, you know, I was raised by a non-practicing Buddhist father and a non-practicing Christian mother, and it was, you know, and I grew up here in Cambridge in the 70s, which is a pretty progressive, radical place, and I spent a number of years just sort of going all around the country to different churches and getting to know people, and really, you can find something interesting in all of those situations, and it's about presenting it in a way that you think is honest. And then if they challenge you and they disagree with you, you have a conversation about it. But I think, you know, you treat them with that kind of respect.
I would say the approach, though, is that you find the thing that's just universal in that person, not the thing that's the quirk. In other words, you're saying you come back and you have all these quirks, right? So that's not interesting in a way. Like that, you know, that's why you want to write about it, right? But you're finding the thing in the person or whatever that is like
relatable.
It's relatable to everybody, and in a way, the rest of it takes care of itself, right? Like I'm writing about lonely people, but they're also wearing these costumes. That is like almost like a secondary fact in a story like that.
We had a question on this side.
Yeah, so one thing that I've kind of run into with kind of all my writers across all the sections that I manage is that they, like, you don't have to get like a certain number, like they get like a certain number of sources per story, but they do like either they do like 3 completely different interviews that you can't really like create into one story, like particularly like it just doesn't work as well as they wanted to, or they do the exact same interview like 4 or 5 times, which is also not super helpful. So the idea of like how is it, like what's the best way to kind of be cognizant of like the overall piece when you're writing or when you're doing an interview that's one part of like a much larger story that has many more people involved in it?
I think you keep in mind why you're interviewing the person, right? And so one thing that we do all the time, I guess it's different for people in print, maybe not, but pre-interviews are really important. Just call them and just chat and get a sense for, do they have anything interesting to say? Do they, are they speaking in jargon all the time? Is there, are you going to get anything good out of it? And then figure out, why am I talking to this person? Is this person the expert who's giving me information, or is this person, do I need to actually get, and figure that out and let that guide your questions. And once you know who each person is, then you'll know, A, do I really need another interview? And B, is this person the right person for the interview that I need? Or do they already serve the exact same function that somebody else who you've got, who you love in your piece?
Yeah, start taking notes when you do the pre-interview. Don't wait for the interview. Start taking notes when you're calling the person and asking them about it, I think, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing, like I would never go out on a story and I would never write a story in advance, obviously, but if I'm on a really tight deadline, a lot of times what I do is I try and outline what my story is going to be. And I figure out based on that, and I'm constantly thinking, especially if I'm, I was covering breaking news in California, which means my deadline is 3 hours shorter, which means I was in Arizona, but my deadline was 3 hours shorter, and I was getting my marching orders at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I couldn't do anything for 3 hours. So during those 3 hours, I pre-wrote chunks of the story in terms of stuff that I already knew, and throughout the whole day when we're trying to deal with Phoenix traffic and getting across town and getting from one thing to another, I could start thinking, how is this person going to fit in, and what's the not to write in sound from them, but what is the thing that I really need them to address, the question.
Can I ask a question? How do you guys get your interviews in the first place? How do you call people? Do you email?
Well, I don't know how other schools do it, but for us we have we'll give our writers a list of places to start, and they're in charge of contacting a list of sources through email.
No, I mean, how do you actually?
Yeah, emails.
Do you do interviews by email? Anybody?
No.
No, don't ever. But emails.
Yeah.
You never call?
I try to call if I can.
Call.
We call if they don't respond to emails, and then we'll just harass them until someone picks up, essentially. And
I would say reverse it, because it takes you longer to write an email.
Yeah.
Especially if you're on deadline. Just pick up the phone and call, and if they don't answer, leave a voicemail and then send an email.
Often they want an email anyway. They'll say, you can talk to them, they'll say, can you send me an email about this or something, and then it's a pain in the ass because you have to do that. But I would always call them or go to them. Go to them. I mean, if you have the time. I just think that the email is just you're blown off so easily. Trust me, they can ignore it. My email doesn't work this week or whatever. I've used these things myself. So, right.
Well, I thought this was a pointed question, but seeing as it just came up,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes you do have to do a phone interview just because of logistical reasons.
Sure, of course.
Now, I was sort of wondering if you all had any tips or suggestions for what you can do to sort of make that interview more successful, just because, talking to a person one-on-one, you can't, pick up on any type of cues beyond what you're receiving on the other end of the phone.
What kind of interview, what kind of story?
I'm the college administration reporter, so I'll talk to a lot of administrators here at the college. It might be about controversial sort of social life issues. It might also be talking to students about sort of what their opinions might be. I often find, just from my own experience, that phone interviews tend to be shorter and a lot more scarce on details. So sort of seeing if there's a way to sort of get more and get sources to talk about more things over the phone.
I think you have to listen even more carefully. And you have to listen for cues, because you don't get visual cues. The plus side of the phone is that you can interrupt more. I think that that's more natural in a phone situation. The downside is that you just have to listen much more carefully and think about, whenever you're doing an interview, I think about what it is that you're trying to get, and you have to listen for those cues really carefully. And do you record your phone calls?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, which is a legal issue too. You obviously have to know your local state laws and stuff. But just trust that your recording is working, and just spend that time listening and highlighting information.
Check it first. I always have somebody call me or check or whatever.
Yeah.
Make sure it's recorded. Yeah.
So you were joking in the beginning about spending so much time with someone you're interviewing that you're basically moving in with them.
Yeah.
And obviously that's ideal, but how do you actually do that? How do you ask someone to sort of impose on them like that and to enter into their private space?
Well, I mean, that's if I'm doing a long form profile of somebody, usually, you know. I explain up front, this is not a little piece, this is not going to be a short piece, it's going to be kind of an in-depth piece, it's going to take a little time where, you know, we really have to kind of explore what's going on. And the idea about spending so much time with somebody is because you want them to be, in a way, we want to honor what you do, right? I mean, I don't know, depends on what you're writing about. But we want to make sure that people understand what your day is like, what you are actually like. And I think people appreciate that in a way because it's like, it's what they're actually, you know what I mean? What you're actually like is the moments between the actual news in a way. That's in a way like what I do is the moments between the news. So I think that's it. It's like, you know, we want, you know, if you're doing a profile of somebody and it's long form, it's like, we want people to understand like what it's like for you to have cereal in the morning or for, you know what I'm saying? Whatever it is, like, it just makes
I think it's just you want to, I think you want to be, and I'm rushing because I know we need to get out of the room, but I think you.
Session's going to be in here, FYI, because it's not on the program.
Got it. So I think you just want to make sure that you're honest and you're upfront about what it is that you're trying to get and why. So do not make promises. If you can't promise it's going to be a long piece, don't make that promise to them. But outline to them, you know, here's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
I want to capture who you are and what what your life is like. And so I need to see as much of that as I can, and then you start your negotiating from there.
Or it's like, honestly, here's what I have in mind. That's what you say. Here's what I have in mind. Sorry.
Is there a question or questions that in some form or another you find you ask in every interview?
For me, the last question is always, what haven't I asked? What haven't I asked that I should have? What, you know, is there anything else that you want to add? And I find that very often, I use those answers probably half the time, almost half the time, maybe not, but I use those answers a lot.
How do you feel about how do you feel? I mean, something really simple.
We're getting kicked out of the room.
Are we? Okay. I mean,
That was what's meant.
people don't ask that question enough. How do you feel about this? That's a really good thing to ask. I mean, sorry, I realize some of this advice is super rudimentary, but we do it all the time, right? I mean, it's like, yeah. You know.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Our contact info is up there. Email us freely. I'm happy to, like, if you guys have questions about any stories that you're working on, I'm happy to chat with you about
If I don't
whatever.
respond to your email, it's not that I'm not interested, it's that my email's so choked that I have to go back and erase 500 emails to get a single email sent out. It's true.
Thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.